setting up your radio tray and you're just getting ready to install the servos in your car, depending on what brand servos you use, the height setting of the servo may need to be different onto the tray. So what I always like to look for is when I install the servos into the radio tray is whether or not I need to use washers or any type of grommet on the servo ear to ensure that they're high enough off the chassis. And what I mean by off the chassis is that what you want to look out for is if you set a straight edge across the bottom posts of the radio tray, you want to make sure that the case sits, approximately a half to a millimeter above where the posts are going to sit onto the chassis. You don't want the case of the servo lower than those posts, or you don't want them to be roughly flush with the bottom of the post, because what will happen is as the car bottoms out over large jumps or goes through large bumps on the racetrack, the chassis will be impacting the bottom of the servo case. And when that happens, that's how you prematurely burn up servos or cause damage to gears or shock the servos. So with the XP Digital servos that I use, what I normally like to do is use one of the silver cone washers underneath the rubber grommets that are supplied with the servos to provide me the proper clearance to make sure that the bottom of my servo cases don't touch the chassis or don't sit too far down. Also, if you got your servos too far down inside the case, what will happen is if they hang lower than the bottom of the servo posts, you're actually going to flex the radio tray when you tighten the screws down, because the post can't make it all the way to the chassis. So that's one thing to look for when you're setting up your servo tray for proper performance of the servos, and also for longevity to keep the stress off them, is to make sure you have a little bit of clearance between the bottom of the post and the bottom of your servo case. The next part, now that we've set the radio tray onto the chassis, is setting up the linkage with the steering servo and with the throttle servo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my radio, turn it on, also going to turn the car on here. And one thing you want to do is make sure that your radio settings are set to where all your trims are zeroed out. You don't have any steering trim, you don't have any throttle trim, all the servos are at their neutral position. Alright, what we're going to do is we're going to start with the steering servo. And what happens a lot of times is you can't get the servo perfectly perpendicular based on where the splines are from the get-go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it into a position where it's the closest we can get to perpendicular with the servo. Alright? And once that's tightened down, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you set your sub-trim on your radio to where your servo horn is at 90 degrees with the servo case. So I'm going to go into the sub-trim and I'm going to set an angle that I'm happy with to where when the servo comes back to neutral, I'm perpendicular and I'm 90 degrees to the servo. Alright? Once that's set in your radio, that's the first step you want to do. After that, you're going to want to come back and try to get the steering rack centered with that trim setting that you've used in your radio. So one trick that I like to use when doing this is I'll take a straight Allen wrench that's long enough, and I will actually lay the wrench straight across the two 4mm screws in the top plate, and then I'll use the extension on the Allen wrench to line up this screw in the steering rack. Okay? So when this is straight across and I'm straight across here, I want the head of this screw to be exactly underneath the extension on this wrench. And what that does is that lets me know that when my servo horn is straight onto my servo, that everything in my steering rack is also symmetrical and perfectly lined up. If this line here is not straight after you've set your servo, you adjust this length to ensure that it is. Okay? You don't want to trim your servo left or right to get this alignment. Once this is set in place, you never want to move it. Okay? So to get that alignment, you're going to adjust the length of your steering servo rod here to line up that underneath. Alright? Once you've set this and you've set that, now the last thing is to set the length of your tie rods here to get the proper toe in of the left and right tire. Okay? And again, if you set everything up correctly the first time, with the first step complete, the second step complete, the length of these tie rods should come out to be, pretty identical. from left to right. So one thing I've seen people do that's incorrect is if their toe isn't straight, you know, they start adjusting left to right on their trim to get the toe straight. The toe should be set straight when your radio is trimmed out to get step 1, 2, and then step 3 correct. Next thing you want to do is when setting up your steering travel, after you've set up your toe, your toe in is set as you want, to set your left and your right endpoint on the car, the key thing that you want to make sure to do is to use our spare caster block that we built earlier. As far as this thing is going to travel is when the steering knuckle bottoms out onto the caster block. That's the maximum steering throw that you can possibly have in the system. Alright, so what you want to do is you want to set your radio to where your endpoint adjustment, may be referred to as travel on other brands of radio, your endpoint adjustment is set to where that knuckle just barely touches and bottoms out on that caster block. And that's your maximum setting. You don't want to have your maximum setting set too far, because if you do, your servo and your linkage is still going to be trying to pull the steering knuckle past its furthest point, therefore adding stress and causing premature possible failures of the servo. Also, it's not going to give you a linear feel if you've got one side set further than the other. So if we turn the car around so you can kind of see it coming down on the car, when I turn my wheel all the way to the left, I've got it set to where that steering knuckle is barely bottoming out on the caster block. Same for when I turn the wheel to the right. And one thing you always want to keep in mind too, if you've done step 1, step 2, now step 3 correctly, when you come into your endpoint adjustment function on the radio, if you can see here on my radio, my steering from left to right is only 2% different on my maximum throw. If you've built your car and to get maximum throw to the left and to the right, you know, you've got a 5, 10, even 15% difference on the endpoint adjustment, then you've got something built incorrectly in your linkage. All right, if you've properly set the car up, you should always be within the same percentage, or even within 2 or 3% difference from left to right to get your max endpoint set. One thing you also want to make sure you do is when you're setting your max endpoints for your steering travel, make sure you have your dual rate set to 100% or whatever the maximum percent is in your radio. All right, a lot of people will confuse dual rate with endpoint adjustment. The endpoint adjustment sets how far left and how far right your linkage will go, and the dual rate is actually basically a proportional number of how far it will go. So to show you that, right now with the dual rate set at 100, as I back the dual rate down, the linkage then starts to straighten back out. Okay, and the dual rate's a good feature if you're on tracks that are real high bite or very bumpy, and you're wanting to limit your steering throw. You'll use your dual rate to do that. That way you're limiting it the same left to right rather than going into your radio and taking out the EPA. Once your EPA is set and it's set correctly, you never want to change that again.